Hello, everybody. How is everyone out there? Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yes, I'm here sporting my red shirt again because we're going to talk about 3 more red flags. As if you didn't have enough from us about things that people potentially did wrong. Well, we're gonna talk a bit more about it, but our goal is to try to help you because these are these red flags that just stand out quickly. These are red flags that come out. Hello, everybody. How's everybody going out there? Hello from Ohio, from England, from Seattle. Hello,
Hello
hello,
from
hello.
unusually sunny England.
Unusual, isn't it? Like you get 5 days of sunshine, is what people say, or something like that.
Yeah, I think we might just be scraping into a second week of summer here, which is exciting.
Wow, that is really exciting. Yeah, I'm in Florida, so it's like the opposite. It's like our summer never ends. It's like, yes, hello, hello. We're here to discuss 3 more red flags. We just love talking about red flags, particularly because of how helpful it is for all of you out there. Because, it's the shoe fits, wear it. Maybe you'll find these are some things that you have fallen into before, some bad habits, or at any rate, you might be able to help somebody else because often we as writers, as soon as somebody finds out you're a writer, they're like, "Oh, can you read my stuff and give my opinion?" And and sometimes it doesn't hit you right, and you don't maybe quite know why because some of these things have become instinctual. Well, we'll explain these red flags, and then you'll be able to determine. They're making that mistake. So, before we get started, I'm just curious what some of the red flags are out there, or what some of your speculation is about what some of the red flags might be out there. I'm curious to see what our audience thinks. What are things that trigger you to assume that, I don't want to keep reading, or this isn't going to turn out well, or something like that? What's something that's just that quick thing? Ooh, somebody says
I just
dialogue.
noticed in comments, yeah, Jeanette Gareth came in so loud I thought someone was in the room and jumped in my chair. I reached my scare quota for the day. Excellent. But yeah, these tips, these additional ones, if you remember the last session last week, I think the good thing about them is those 3 last week are kind of the immediate ones to pay attention to in the very early stages of your stories. These ones will be a bit more expansive, going a bit deeper in, but of course all of them are relevant to the beginning. That will get you rejected quite quickly. So I hope that with the 6 of them, they build a little kind of guideline structural thing for everybody to follow, just things to really keep in mind when you're making a pass on your drafts.
We have a few more comments. Using the wrong name of the agent. That is correct. Not what we're talking about today, but no, it is never a great idea to be like, "Dear Robert," and you're talking to Laura. No, I would not recommend that. Head hopping, changing tense, uninteresting from the get go, starting with telling. Well, those are all great suggestions, and we're going to find out maybe if some of them are in our red flags. Let's start with red flag number 1, which is overuse of adverbs. Gareth, do you want to kick us off on adverbs? You're the Stephen King fan, right? So he says the road to hell is paved with adverbs, right?
Yeah, well, Stephen King's famous quote, "The road to hell is paved with adverbs." Now, that's not to say that the man himself sticks 100% to that rule, because there's often a fair amount of adverb usage, especially in his early work. But he is correct in that sense. Overuse of adverbs will drive any editorial eye insane. Um, really, we know what adverbs are, all those weak modifiers. You're slapping ly words in constantly to modify something to make it sound grander, is just more often than not you can just pick a stronger word. Why use 2 words when you can use 1? Is really a sign of stronger writing. So don't overuse adverbs. They will stand out very quickly, much like repetition. It's almost repetition of just the ly of the modifier will stand out very quickly. And yeah, Laurie, I love him, and then he goes and uses them.
Yeah, and to your point, it's just funny. I noticed while you were saying it, you said don't use adverbs because they'll stand out very quickly. Of course, filled with adverbs. But in dialogue, it's a little bit different in terms of within those quotation marks, because we tend to use adverbs partly because as people, we don't tend to speak as concisely as we would like. We'll throw in those modifiers. We'll be a little bit less elegant in our speech than we tend to want in our prose. We tend to want our prose to not sound so casual, and I mean it's a style, but when you start throwing in all those extra words, it can sound lazy and uninspired, and it also can just not hit the audience the way you want emotionally. Like, here's an example I have. She hurriedly walked down at the very horrifically bad looking building. This is an egregious example to demonstrate what, how adverbs can, excuse me. I'm so I'm so choked up about it. How adverbs can negatively affect writing, because here we have them propping up two things. They're propping up a weak verb and they're propping up a weak noun. They can do both. You know what I mean, Gareth?
Indeed, I can see. I totally agree with what you said about dialogue, and I can see Jack in the comments says, "Okay, serious question: how often should rules apply to dialogue?" Um, to my mind, we'll get into this. Spoiler alert: with dialogue, as far as I'm concerned, especially initially, those rules kind of go out the window. Just from my personal perspective, some may be more hardline about that, but I think if you go through and tried to remove, as Daniel said, all adverbs from dialogue, especially the people are speaking, and you try to obey all of these quote unquote rules, like cutting out filler words and things like that. If you tried to apply that to dialogue across the board, everybody is going to sound robotic. It's not going to
Right.
sound like real people talking. So dialogue, that's kind of, keep that for the loosen your reins on the rules, have a little bit more fun with dialogue, but within the narrative prose, yeah, we don't want it sounding like this example.
And even in dialogue, I wouldn't recommend a sentence like this, because I've never heard anybody speak in this way. I mean, I could maybe see somebody saying something like horrifically bad looking building, maybe if they're just somebody that's flustered or something like that. But even then, when you're just, the thing about adverbs is you can use adverbs to modify adverbs, right? So you could just layer and layer and layer and layer, and it could just completely take over. Going back to Stephen King, he said they were like dandelions, right? You have a couple on your lawn and then they just take over. But to demonstrate in this example, I mean, instead of hurriedly walked, we could use a much better verb like raced, scampered, scurried, whatever. And then instead of very horrifically bad looking building, you could say, dilapidated shed or rundown house, or something, something that would, maybe an adjective noun combination, or maybe a specific noun, if you think there's a specific noun that would work well for a horrifically bad looking building in your arsenal. But it just would land so much better than that, because especially something like hurriedly walked, because then you're like, well, why aren't they just saying run? Do they mean that they're like, it's like the Olympics and they have to make sure there's like a foot on the ground each step, or something? It's like you're going about it such a strange way versus just being straightforward with your language. At least that's
Unless
how I
it's
usually read stuff like that.
unless it's a story about someone who's addicted to power walking and just can't stop.
Right. Right. And then that would be an authorial choice that would actually great. By the way, that's a writing prompt for you. Somebody addicted to power walking and just can't stop. You heard it here. Here's
Stephen, before we move on there, I just
Oh
saw a
yeah.
comment from Stephen. Do all these flags apply to short stories with the same weight as they apply to novels? I would say yes. Much in the same way that if a short story of yours is a submission to a potential anthology, and the editor is reading it, if you are submitting something to agents and editors too, well, not so much editors, you're going to be paying them, but agents are going to want to look at maybe the first few pages, first 10 pages of your actual novel, and in that same length of time, they're also looking to be engaged and entertained and sense a story as much as they would if it were a short story that's given to them. So yes, I would put an equal amount of focus in.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think sometimes people think, well, it's shorter, and so some of these kind of writer tics or things, they're not going to come across as annoying because I only am with you for a short period of time. But, and to some extent, I can see where they're coming from with that. It's like, there are people you can only spend 10 minutes with, and more than that they would start to irritate you. But some of these problems are literally like the person that within a few seconds are like, get me out of this conversation, I don't want to talk to you anymore. It's just that off-putting to certain to readers. And beyond that, it can really rob your writing of the power, because the reason why you're writing is to convey concepts, and if your concepts are awesome but the way you're conveying them is just muddled and these poor choices of words, well, people aren't going to really pay attention to the concepts. They're going to be so distracted by the mechanics of the whole thing. Let me give another example, though, of where adverbs can really mess with prose. And this is kind of a weird example, but let's look. They saw the huge eyes, sharp claws, and white teeth of the monster as it moved towards them happily. What can happen sometimes? You're like, this guy. What can happen sometimes is that the modifier goes at the end and it modified everything that came up to it. Now, if this was supposed to be like a comedy moment, isn't it funny? It might work, but often you'll see people do this and they don't intend to, and so you almost have to reread the sentence. Well, if you do that enough times, you're asking your audience to use the brain power that you're trying to get them towards what you're talking about what even you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, what does it even mean? It gets confusing. And I've it's funny that as much as this is an over the top example, this is something that I actually do see fairly often, where I feel like I just have to constantly go back with, especially early writers, because they'll put those words at the end that change the whole emotional content of a sentence. And adverbs is a cheap way of doing it.
I was surprised as soon as I saw that. I thought, that's got to be comedy. It's one of these juxtapositions of all
Right.
the nasty imagery, and then it's a happy little.
Yeah.
It's almost the Monty Python killer rabbit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. It's this big buildup, and then it's the non sequitur. The other way the way that this will come up maybe more often than prose, well, I'd say definitely more often prose, is in dialogue tags, right? We can all think of dialogue where somebody will say something and there's a certain emotional resonance to it, and then you read the dialogue tag and it says they said it, and there's a modifier, and it changes the entire way that sentence would have read to you. And because they put it at the end, it's like you have to go back and you have to think about, okay, I completely didn't understand the way that was supposed to come across. And so that's a really risky thing to do, and one reason why to avoid adverbs in your dialogue tags. Like this. I'm wanting to go to the store, he said very, very angrily. You have to reread that. Not that I'm wanting to go to the store is a great sentence in the first place. I have some poor writers that give me examples. I'm just saying. But what I would say is what you really want is within the dialogue, for the dialogue itself to resonate emotionally what you want. When people are emotional, and they will talk with different words, different vocabulary, different styles. And so to just slap that adverb on the end and be like, okay, well, now the audience is going to understand how they were feeling, it's just so lazy, and don't do it. This is something I'm sure you've seen a fair amount, right, Gareth?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our second red flag, which is bad dialogue. Yes. And that was an example of bad dialogue in that the sentence was just so matter of fact, even though the author was trying to convey anger. And yes, I know some people are restrained in their anger. Fair enough. But too often, the dialogue just does not carry the emotional weight that the author intends, and it just hangs there, and it's boring. And I don't know what in terms of dialogue, Gareth. What are some of your biggest pet peeves in terms of what makes dialogue poor?
Well, when dialogue will stand out to me is two ways. What Daniel previously said there in adverbs is, of course, if your dialogue is just absolutely covered in adverbs in the dialogue tags, and too many dialogue tags. Just trying to make it sound more impactful than it is. The dialogue itself should be able to carry the emotion and the points that you want it to carry. On the second point, when it comes to dialogue as well, one thing that will put me off very quickly, or just send me back to the drawing board with a scene, is flat dialogue, where all the characters sound the same, or the dialogue itself isn't really carrying anything meaningful. They're just a couple of characters talking between themselves for no real reason. There's nothing buried in there that's interesting. And often, I think the more common one is that you will go through and find that the characters just sound the same. There's no, what I like to call, sparkle to it. And when dialogue sets in any story, whether it's a short story or I'm reading the beginning of a novel, as soon as people start to speak, I want to feel that sparkle. Now, when I say this is how I refer to it to myself as sparkle, I mean character. I mean something that is identifying this person to me verbally, that they have a personality that comes through in the words that they're saying, and the way they speak. And if that doesn't happen, well, very quickly, I'm not getting involved, because they don't feel like they're coming alive for me. No, it's probably a bit of a misnomer to call it sparkle, as I said, because that doesn't mean that every character has to be all, hey, happy, and then kind
They
of
don't have
jumping
to be
off.
vampires that sparkle in the sunlight, Gareth.
Definitely not. But yeah, they don't have to be all happy and jumpy and lively in that regard. It can definitely be a very, very dark character, a deep anti-hero or a villain who's exceptionally twisted. But in the way they speak, there's something interesting there that's different from everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly villains, Darth Vader's "I find your lack of faith disturbing." So there's so many famous lines we can think of from deplorable characters, and Darth Vader does sparkle in a sense. And now people are like, "What?" Although I've seen some sparkling Darth Vaders at Comic Cons before, but that's another story. But yeah, no, they glow. They have there's a neon, there's an attraction to them because of the way that they're putting their words together, for sure. When you talk about everyone sounding the same, this is something that I come across all the time. I feel like what writers are better at is figuring out, okay, well, every character needs to serve a purpose in the story. So it's like, okay, it's almost like the heist format, where it's like, okay, this person's the one that's good with computers, and this is the person that's good with our, and they kind of have a job for everybody to do. But what they neglect to do is make them different personalities, because they make the mistake of saying, well, the job they're doing and personality are the same thing, which of course it's not. And then everyone kind of just talks the same, which you imagine to be probably similar to the way that the author might put things. And it's not interesting to read, because it's like an endless monologue. And one thing that I like to challenge people to do is to take a step outside the plot and think of the characters from their viewpoint and their worldview. And it's like reality shows where they do those psychological tests on their contestants, and they deliberately put a bunch of people together that have opposing worldviews, so it's fireworks. It's highly manipulative, but essentially that's what you want to do as an author. You want to be like, who would be really lousy in a room together? Let's put them in, because it's going to be much more interesting to see different people reacting to the same problem in different ways and things like that.
Yeah, you'll often find this problem is one that when your dialogue is what's called on the nose, it's just so obvious. People are just directly speaking to each other, and it feels like the dialogue, it has two effects. Well, number one is they start to all sound the same, and number two, it begins to feel like the dialogue is only existing to further the plot to the ends of the author. Now, on one hand, yes, the dialogue does, anything that happens in the story exists to further the plot, of course, but it shouldn't be transparent in that utility. And that happens when it's exactly like what Daniel said there. When you have two characters in a scene and you're thinking, okay, well, the purpose of this scene is to follow the plot along these lines or resolve this particular thing. The scene should have a purpose. If you're finding that your dialogue in that scene is just really on the nose and you can't figure out why it's so flat, and it's obvious that it's only there for this plot point to be said or revealed, is take a step back. Step outside of the plot and look at the characters and think, okay, well, it could be interesting when you're looking at it from a 360-degree view is, right, who are these characters? What are their personalities? what is the context within which this scene takes place? What's going on in the plot and the world around them? How is that affecting their current state, their current mood, their current outlook, their current relationship with each other in that moment when that conversation is taking place? And flavor that conversation with all of that. If you find that there is nothing surrounding them really that could make its way into there, well, you most likely have a scene that doesn't matter. Because it's, there's no outside pressure on it. There's nothing going on around it that's shaping it into something functional. It's just there to put a plot point in. Find a better way to do that.
Exactly. You don't want your characters to sound like a synopsis on Wikipedia about what is going on. It's the old "as you know" sort of things, right? This is a common test that people will say is if a character can start a sentence with "as you know," or if your character does start a sentence with "as you know," you may want to ask yourself, why are they even talking about this? Because if they're just talking about it so that the audience can understand, it is contrived. You have to be careful. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't play these games as authors and we don't have characters talk about things that they already know just for the sake of exposition, but you do have to be careful with it because it can come across so obvious. The classic example that satirizes this is in the Great Muppet Caper, where the woman just keeps going on and on and on. Miss Piggy's like, "Why are you telling me all this?" And she's like, "It's plot exposition. It has to go somewhere, you know." And that's essentially what you don't want. You don't want, those scenes where the character just starts talking and talking and talking. You haven't fooled anybody that you're not doing just too much exposition in your prose or too much upfront exposition. You are just burying it in your dialogue, and no, we're going to see right through that.
Well, of course, the "as you know" can be used to effect. I think most often when you see something like that, and a good way to use it is when one character is talking down to another.
Mm-hmm.
With It's that the audience already knows the information, the character already knows the information, so it's not something new that's being given to us, sort of "as you know," but it's being handed down with derision.
Right.
And when you do something like that, again, you're building conflict in that scene. You're building a
Right.
tension in the air between the two characters. So that's good. That's kind of what you're always going for, especially with your dialogue. Is there's always something kind of crackling in the air there. And if you don't feel that, the dialogue is probably flat.
Right. And another example I can think of an "as you know" that worked pretty well is in Back to the Future, where they're like, "Oh, let's talk about how we met." And they're like, "Oh, we've heard that story 80 million times." And it's again, it reveals character, it reveals their sentimentality. Of course, it's an on the nose information dump, but it works in the context of the scene because it is revealing more than just that. um at least that's how I feel about it. But to Gara's point about on the nose dialogue, uh it is really frustrating. Let's look at an example. "How are things?" "Wonderful. Couldn't be better. And you?" "The world is my oyster. How's your report?" "It's amazing. Everything is just dandy." "I agree. I've never felt so good about our business. I trust your work and I trust your brilliant leadership skills." This is not only on the nose, it's like way over the top and positive. And if you were to read this, and the scene is about two people that are being very disingenuous with each other and cutting each other, and that's the subtext, it would be wonderful because that's how people talk. But oftentimes, authors do this sort of stuff and they are trying and you don't know how to take it because it's so unnatural as to how people speak. Whenever when I'm doing like my editorial things, because I do some of the story inspectors here, and I get to dialogue like this, I'll start putting in my comments. I'm like, if one of these people are a serial murderer, then this is okay, but otherwise, this doesn't come across as genuine. Essentially, it's like if I'm supposed to be suspicious of that somebody is hiding something, then this works great. But if somebody is not hiding something, this is not how they talk. And there's so many different clues like that. So something that, as somebody who writes dialogue, you have to really get into how people talk. You really have to study it a little bit, and the subtext that goes on to conversation and how people speak to their emotions. Because most people do not just flat out say what they're thinking. In fact, that's often the opposite of what is going on. And so And honestly, as a reader, it's much more interesting to read conversations where you're having to read between the lines. It's like, what do they really think? Because I don't know, and watching those sort of conversations, especially with two people with opposing viewpoints that are at each other's throats but aren't really speaking to that, those conversations can be delightful. They're some of my favorite. And then, of course, you have the monologue. Incredibles made fun of this, right? Where the villain just goes on and on and on, revealing their plan when it doesn't make any sense. It's just like, because this information has to get out there, and it's like, blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to tell you everything, including things that you don't really need to know and would undermine myself. Yeah, be careful with that sort of dialogue, because it can work, I suppose, if you're legitimately doing like a James Bond villain who's arrogant, which I guess is often the context. But even so, try to make them a little more intelligent, because when they give away the farm in order to kind of dunk on the hero at the 11th hour, it just doesn't tend to work very well.
Yeah, I think these days, used unironically, the villain monologue is almost as egregious as the horror trope of the survivors not landing the killing blow on the villain when they have the chance.
Right. And I honestly, too, you can thank Brad Bird for pointing this out to audiences too, which has made even casual readers start to wonder about it because it's a Incredibles was a pretty famous movie. All right. So that being said, let's move on, because we're talking about a lot of the problems with dialogue relate to people just kind of oversharing information. And that really brings us to the third red flag, which is information overload. This probably is my number one critique. I don't know. It happens an awful lot. What do you think, Gareth?
For this one, if it happens to you an awful lot, I'll let you lead the way on it.
Well, that sounds good. Information overload. This is like, I like this graphic example I found. I'm here driving on a car. I'm trying to go down the road, and there's just all this stuff in my way. And it's stuff that I'm like, I don't know why the author is sharing all of this information. And what I often tell my students or anybody in my classes or anybody who's starting to write is, the only information that an audience needs at any given moment, excuse me, is only what is beneficial to understand the exact tension that the character is going in that exact moment. So if you're starting your story with a hook of some sort of tension, which you should, and it's like, oh, I don't know, I'm sorry, allergies. And it's something like, I don't know, my keys are missing or something like that, just to kind of kick things off. Not necessarily the best hook to start with, but I'm just giving an example. What I don't need to know is their family history, or the last 100 years of that county where they're living, or the planet they're living on's environmental systems, or anything like that, because I can relate to something as basic as I have an object that's missing and I can't seem to find them. So what would be more interesting information is the emotional importance of the keys, what they matter, how often it's to happen, what does this speak to the character, things like that. And as the story progresses, you can reveal all those other things. You need enough information, and also I need to know how difficult it might be to find the key. So how big of a place is it? Things like that. Yes. So the problem when people say, when people have to deal with like what they call information dumps, is like, they have the impulse. I can't just start, with nothing. I can't just start with action, because then nobody will have any clue what's going on. And you're right. And I have seen examples like that where it's like, people are fighting and I like have no clue why I'm caring about it. But on the other side, what happens more often is people feel like they need to give this laundry list of world building, including character backstory and just all kinds of information that does not matter for where you're at that moment. It's kind of like, you think of it kind of like you're going on a date with somebody, and right off the bat, you don't necessarily need to hear like their entire resume, their entire life history, things like that. That would be considered a pretty boring date. And especially if it wasn't very interesting, which is often a problem as well, is that you're going to include a lot of information that maybe is helpful. It's like they have so many sisters, so many, their parents died at a certain age or things like that. But until you get to the point in the story where it matters, you don't really need that info. And there's a chance that by the time you get to that point in the story, the audience is just going to forget, especially if you just barrage them with so much information up front. Because if you just get this fire hose of data, you're like, I don't know how to sort this.
Yeah, that it happens. When that happens, it's you're kind of left there without a context to apply all this information to. One of the reasons that I believe this happens, having dealt with it quite a lot, is from a quite an earned sense of pride from the author in terms of world building. They've really done the work to figure out the background to a lot of this, and it's just eager to make sure that all of that work makes it onto the page. But the real solution to it there is, it's kind of like Daniel said, is fight the urge. If something needs to go in there, well, then it goes in there when the time is contextually right. If it's something that is part of your extensive world history that you've built, however, let's say it's in the past, and a huge event in the past has now, flavored what life is like in the present. Unless what happened in the past, the specific details of that are actually relevant to the story as is right now in the present, well, then I don't need to know that. However, lots of people do get caught up in that because they're so proud of the history that they've built it and traced through the timeline that gets to this point. I guess a simple kind of illustration of that might be, let's say it's a sci-fi story, and something in the planet's history, like the third moon exploded, and that has changed the times of day or the weather and things like this and made it more inhospitable to life. Maybe there's a scene where it's getting to that time and the character has to put themselves in cover, and they're doing that. Well, then this kind of info dumping would be, the character looks up at the sky, sees the changes, goes into the cover, and then you immediately go into an info dump. Ever since the third moon exploded, this was what happened to the planet and all this. It's not relevant. We don't need that history right there because we're in that moment with the character. Just bring it to us later if that history is relevant. Otherwise, you could hint at it. There's shards of the moon in the sky. It's mysterious. We're wondering about this kind of stuff, but we don't need it.
Right. And even more egregious is when people include that and they're just like having coffee and they're like, and they look out and there's not even a tension point with what they're info dumping about. It's just part of the set dressing. I in terms of like analogies, I think of it as somebody who comes from theater, and often actors are asked, by directors, they're like, sit down and they, like a dramaturge they call it, and they're supposed to go in and write the backstory of their character and just all of this information about the character. Well, guess what? I mean, the script is the script. They're not adding that into the show, but what they want is for the actor to come in with that weight, and so every line is being filtered through a complex character that they've created, and the audience can feel that, which is why actors are asked to do that. And so it's not a bad thing at all for you to know all this information. In fact, it's a great idea. The problem, like Garrett says, is that you spend all this time thinking this through and getting involved and falling in love with it and getting immersed in it and in loving your characters, that you just want to overshare. You want to share every little detail. And it does not work well for your story. It might work well in terms of conveying all the effort you put into, but in terms of dealing with pacing and getting the audience interested in the narrative, that specific tension point that the character's going in, it's just going to weigh it down because it's not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I can see Anne has a good comment there as well. If your novel is really successful and the backstory is interesting, you could include it as a shorter book. People who love your book will buy that too. That's definitely a possibility. Again, if you have put so much work into the history and the world building, but it's just not relevant in the present story. But of course, it is the bedrock of everything that the present story is taking place on. That, of course, that could be a whole other book. It could be, what's the word? It's like an encyclopedia,
Right.
things like that are all in your
Companion.
world. Fantastic stuff, and fans will be all over that.
Right.
On the other side too, I do want to say that kind of this. What information you do give out in world building, there is somewhat of a sweet spot in the middle. It's not to say don't use any at all here, because you can go to really, really, really bad place. As Daniel was talking, something came into my mind, which I'm not sure everybody will be able to contextually place it, but in the world of video games, there was something that came out a good number of years ago on launch called Destiny. And that game is really, really big in terms of its lore. There's lots and lots going on with different factions warring, and you're in the middle of it all, and there's great history behind everything. Now, before Bungie released that game, they essentially stripped all story elements out of it. The original writers' ideas for everything was turned upside down. They watered it down, stripped it all out of the game. And this meant that when you, as the player, were going through missions, your little buddy, who was originally voiced by Peter Dinklage, was using terms and talking about things that didn't mean, you had no context for any of this. And that led to, in the gaming world, quite a funny meme going around where he just exclaims at one point, "There's a wizard on the moon." And nobody knew what that meant. It was just complete random nonsense being spewed in the middle of this story. And then people got doubly angry when Bungie said, if you want to read the history and everything, then you have to download a separate app, which was their encyclopedia, and then just sit on your phone and read about what everything you were playing actually meant. So, don't dial back that far, because you don't want
Mm-hmm.
people saying things and referencing things and making contextual references to stuff that you have not informed the reader of at all. It's not involving that way either.
Right. And it is a genre thing as well. I would say there are some genres, when I think of like epic fantasy and things like that, that there is more of an appetite for readers, partly because of the otherworldliness of the environment, that they want to wade a little bit more through information. And you can argue, well, is it really that important that you knew that for the hero's journey exactly, or is it just making the place a believable environment? And so that's where I think it can kind of confuse authors, because they can see it's one of those rules that people seem to break all the time and get away with it. But I think it comes back to engagement. Where I find it tends to have the biggest problem is when it's not speaking to anything very creative. It's more mechanical. It's like telling you, well, this happened and things like that, in somebody's life, or, just weird details about their living environment, when their living environment is more or less, a standard apartment in Atlanta, Georgia, or something. And so you really don't need that much information about it. I feel like that's where it really is obvious, right? When it gets to having to explain a truly rich creative environment, then like Garrett says, you're really going to have to find that sweet spot, because that's quite a different task. because to fully understand what is going on dramatically is part of it, but there is a part of that genre, of those genres, that is about just also enjoying the world too. So you're kind of having to do both in a way that I would say like a romance novel doesn't have to do, or a mystery novel doesn't have to do.
Yeah, and I think, like Daniel just said there as well, this sort of thing does tie back into the flat dialogue as well. Because, if you want to get this stuff out of you, you're like, oh, I just need to. Like Arnold saying, I ask myself, why am I telling the reader this now? It hurts when I worked hard to create facts that nobody cares. It's like they do care. They intrinsically have to care, because you used that information that you built to set the bedrock foundations for the story that's taking place. It couldn't happen without that history. So, of course, it matters. Just not being overt about it. Otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
this is when you end up with scenes with the two characters sitting in an apartment and talking to each other about, hey, remember that time when? And then you just spew out a load of historical stuff that is not having any impact in that moment, is not having any impact really on the story at that point. And if it is, or it does have an impact on the story, well, then it needs to be placed and fed to the reader more dynamically and more dramatically than two characters sitting there going, hey, remember that time when?
Yeah. And I would say too, in terms of information dumps, there are two exceptions that come up a lot that help out with information. One is if by conveying the information, you're also revealing something about the character, it can help a lot. So, for example, if you are having to give the backstory about something, but it speaks to the character's reaction to it, then it's going to make the audience contextualize why this information is being told to them, because they can say, oh, well, whatever, this planet's been at war for hundreds of years and blah blah blah, and this person is like sarcastically kind of retelling it in the prose. It's like it kind of gives you an insight as to their view on the world. Be careful, tread cautiously, but that can help. The other thing is if it's funny. Exposition that is funny, you can almost always get away with. So if it's even if it's something mundane and just like whatever, there's a spot on the carpet, it's like, well, if there's a funny reason why there's a spot on the carpet, they accidentally one time dropped a watermelon on their mother-in-law or something, people are going to find that funny, even there's no relevance to the story. And you wanted to include that detail because for some reason you just picture the room with that. And again, that gets to entertainment, that gets to engagement. I think what we're really trying to avoid is information being given to you in a way that feels like you're reading a cliff notes of something, like it's homework. To Garrett's point, it's like the people that didn't include it in that game, and then you had to read this compendium that's like a glossary, right? Yeah, that's what you're really trying to avoid, for sure. And the more information you give people at once, no matter how entertaining it is, the more it just starts to feel like a glossary. Because then it just feels like a more entertainingly written glossary. Also, too, you have to factor how much can somebody absorb at once, especially without context. Just abstract pieces of data, they're not going to absorb much. So they're going to just start glazing over it because they're going to realize it. They're like, well, I'm not even going to be able to absorb all this. So I'm just going to keep going until the story gets interesting. And then if you actually included something that was great foreshadowing, it's just going to come from left field because they'll probably just overlooked it. Let's look at some of these comments. In a short story, should first, I'm guessing first paragraph be show tell conflict, the second give info about the character and how the info relates to the conflict. Example, the character's job will relate to something later.
Let's I gotta hold on to that one.
Okay.
for a minute. Yes, everybody can start getting a little bit excited now for other things. But I did see a question there from Kelly about can an information dump be in a prologue if it sets up the world that the story exists in, done during a scene it matters in, sort of. Now, that's not particularly uncommon. If a prologue to me is ever going to be used, well, then perhaps, yes, that's the place to do it. If you're then going to set bedrock, something that's happened that is leading into the story, and then your chapter one is entering the story, perhaps. But again, even if you are using a prologue to fill that in, the prologue itself should be just as interesting and dynamic and dramatic as anything else to come after it. It can't simply be a page ripped from a glossary or a compendium that says, hey, this is the history.
Yeah. I think that impulse comes a bit too from film, because film is a different medium. I've spoken to this before, in that audiences, by the time they get to a film, usually have seen more interesting scenes from the film because of trailers, and you kind of have them at that point, although that's moving a little bit away with people not being stuck in the theater. But getting the slow beginnings, information dumps beginnings, were a little more acceptable, because I can think of the example of like Lord of the Rings. The film Fellowship of the Ring starts with a huge information dump. The book doesn't in the same way, because the book starts with talking about the hobbits and talking about back end and getting you involved in the characters, and then when you get to the ring, then you get the information dump, right? So it's interesting that the novel didn't do that, whereas the movie did, and I think that there was a reason for that.
Yeah, a lot of this too. I can see Arnold's comment. Most common nobody cares facts relate to location or place or history of something, not so much about character or personality or plot. There is something to be said about that, and this is a thing that a lot of people fall into, and in basic storytelling, not just fiction, writing prose, but also screenwriting, in telling stories that have these interesting created worlds. Now, an easy thing to slide in there, or a concept, would be to think of like a little small community or a city that's run by raiders, let's just say, and it's a dangerous place to go, and it has its own kind of social structure and all the rule of law and all the things that go in there. It's hard town. Nobody really wants to be around there. Often, if the story itself is being placed in a limited point of view with a character who is not familiar with that place, some writers will try to send them to that place, but to alert the reader of what it's like ahead of time. So then there's an info dump that sets it up. So then you're worried about the character going in. Now,
Yes.
the way that should really work is the character either goes in blind and you experience it along with them and see what it's like, or most often, if you want to set it up, you will have a character that knows the place going with someone else who doesn't. Whether the someone who knows the place is your main character, your protagonist, or the other person, there'll often be that character that they join with who is able to be their guide or take them into this place, and they're kind of like, let me do the talking, you stand there. And then you completely avoid info dumps. You are just there seeing the culture take place. There's no need to dump it ahead of time.
Right. I'm also thinking of like suspense type stories or like monster type stories will have a scene to demonstrate this is the evil that's coming, but it's not an info dump. It's literally like a scene. There's characters in it. Usually somebody dies, there's stakes, and then you switch to your protagonist. So you're nervous about your protagonist because oh no, they're getting close to this thing I've seen before. But it's not just a narrator being like, well, back 100 years ago, there was a thing and somebody died, because that's not very compelling.
Yeah, you don't want the Star Wars Chapter 3 scrawl.
Yeah.
It doesn't work anymore.
It doesn't work too much. And honestly though, even in that example, think of how short in terms of text those scrolls are. It's like what, 3 paragraphs or something? It's certainly
true.
a lot less than what I see writers trying to get away with.
Well, there's one example. If you want to see a complete failure of that kind of thing, it's the opening to Uwe Boll's film adaptation of Alone in the Dark. He tries to do a Star Wars type scroll, but it is literally about 6 minutes long with the really slow, like this is a horror film narrator talking over it. It is it'll make every part of you cringe.
Or I think of M. Night Shyamalan's Lady in the Water. Of course, that has so many other problems besides just the technique used, but that's another egregious example.
So,
although a really entertaining watch, if you ask me.
Shall we finish on those tips? We could probably go on all day about all of these, folks, but
that's true.
We do have some announcements to move on to.
That sounds good, Gareth. Let's go.
So I hope everything has been helpful. I saw some questions in the comments there about from those who have been following us with the writing challenge. Yes, you'll be happy to know the selection process is continuing. Last week we had the long list at 70. We're down to a short list of 40 right now. So we're really, focusing down. We're getting there. And we'll have more to let you know soon. Now, one thing as well, you may notice that I've come in different garb today.
You have, Gareth.
Last week I was working on my abs. This time I'm fishing. And that kind of goes into something that we talked about last week. And we had a lot of feedback about that being particularly useful in terms of opening lines and the opening hook. So, of course, here today I'm fishing with my hook. Now, what we're going to do to spoil a couple of surprises, but next Tuesday's live stream, I'll be back to do a What's the Score exploration of this month's new AutoCrit comparison author, who is Philip Pullman. We'll be having a look through the Golden Compass.
Nice.
I believe it's the first of his Dark Materials. Is that the series?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
We will be picking that apart next Tuesday, same time at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then the Tuesday after that, we will be doing one of our live shows, which we have tentatively titled Hook 'em, where we're going to help you with your opening hooks and see what we kind of feel and get from the opening lines of our viewers. The important thing with that as well is we actually want you to send them in to us, because we're going to pick what we can and go through them live and see kind of what impressions we get and how it could be improved in any way. If you would like to be a part of that, fortunately the link is a bit weird, so I'm just going to drop it into the comments here on YouTube if I can find the right. There we go.
Hopefully the hook doesn't involve hooking me when I tell bad dad jokes, but Take me off stage. Close the stream
Well,
down.
Beth would have told you before I started writing a story, because I one day I was sitting there and I thought, well, I'm trying to think of something to write. What do? Start the story with a hook. So it literally opens with a hook splitting somebody in half. And
There you go.
I thought, yeah, let's just do that, because that's simple. But
Fair.
anyway, there's the link there in the YouTube comments. If you click on that, it will take you to a submission form for Hook'em, and you can submit your opening line to us, and we'll 2 weeks time have our live stream. So if you want to be ahead of the curve, it's not actually been announced yet. We will be emailing everybody about it on Friday with the link as well. But if you want to be first in line, by all means. I think not necessarily first in line to get covered during the live stream, because we'll randomize them to make sure everybody gets a fair chance of being seen. But we'll get through as many as we can within the hour.
I'm so excited. Just try to look out for these red flags. Beware of those adverbs in that opening line. Just saying. Don't start with just a lot of boring information.
Indeed. And that
If
brings
you
me
have
back.
dialogue, don't make it too boring or on the nose.
Make sure it sparkles.
Yeah, sparkle.
Going back to Lynn, it's like he bared his fangs and sparkled in the sunlight. In a short story from this was Lynn's question that we kind of left for this, but in a short story, should the first paragraph show or tell conflict? The second, give info about the character and how the info relates to the conflict. For example, the character's job will relate to something later. Now, I would say in a short story, it's pretty much always a good thing for your first paragraph to show me some kind of conflict in action. That's your hook. If I get an immediate sense something's going on here and I want to know more about it, and conflict is a great way to do that. And then naturally, it makes sense in progression of information to then follow up that initial conflict with some more contextual information about the conflict. So yes, that's a good way to think about it. I don't think necessarily has to go that way, but it's a good way to start.
Yeah. It's like the in late out early kind of philosophy, which means, you're in late enough that things are getting interesting. And certainly for short story, I think, in late out early really applies, because you just have a limited amount of time. So just cut to the chase, cut to the action, to the tension point, to what makes it interesting as fast as you can. So yeah, I think those instincts make perfect sense. Well, those are some really awesome shows, I have to say, Gareth. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to what's the score, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of your hooks out there, because I'm sure you're going to have some really good ones. And it's always a fun thing to do, because it's so open, because it's like you get to do whatever, because you don't have to know how you would pay off a hook, right? Go ahead and paint yourself into that artistic corner with a crazy hook you have no idea how you pull off. Why not? Go for the moon. It's fun.
Yeah, just try something, even if you don't have anything right now. Try coming up with a line that when we're doing it makes us go, I want to read more.
Right, yeah. And even if you're like, yeah, I would have no idea how I would pay that off. That's cool. That's fine. That could be your answer. It's about stretching. It's about stretching yourself. So think of that. Don't put yourself into a box, and we'll have a lot more fun. I'm so excited about it. So anyway, we will see you out here on the interwebs, as they call it, on our YouTube channel. Subscribe, hit the bell, let us know. Can you submit more than one opening line? We will not read the second line, so I would not recommend doing that.
If they're individual opening lines as well, pick your best one. It would be
Yes.
best to have one each, because just to keep it fair, that everybody gets covered with the same chances of getting seen.
Yeah. So yes, one line, please make it count, and we will see you all next week for What's the Score? Bye, everybody.
Bye.